I've already explained who I am. And I'm going to talk now about two relatively recent invasive bacterial pathogens of trees. The first one being fireblight. And the photograph on the right shows fireblight infecting a rowan tree. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then horse chestnut bleeding canker, obviously both of them bacterial diseases. Horse chestnut bleeding canker caused by Pseudomonas syringae pathovar esculi. And you can see the lower photograph here is a horse chestnut with classic symptoms of bark cracking and bleeding. So I'll talk about fireblight. So fireblight is not native to the UK. This was introduced into the UK in the 1950s from North America. And I believe it was first found in a pear orchard in Kent in the late 1950s. And the person who's done a lot of work on fireblight in the UK is a lady called Eve Billings. I had the pleasure of meeting her very briefly in 2010 at a conference, and she was 89 and still busy writing papers, and as John says, yes, figuring out her modelling problems. So I'd just like to acknowledge Eve Billing as being quite seminal to the understanding of fireblight in the UK. It's a very serious pathogen of apple, pear and other Rosaceae species. And it's widespread in southern England and Wales, and it's also established in parts of Scotland. And its spread in England, I think, has been exacerbated by the fact that hawthorn is quite a susceptible species, and it's been able to spread along hawthorn hedges. And you can see the lower photograph here shows hawthorn with the browning due to infection with fireblight. So it used to be a notifiable disease. It's no longer, because it's now established in Britain, but it is still currently absent from the Isle of Man, Northern Ireland and the Channel Islands. So in terms of symptoms to look out for, it's introduced into new areas on infected planting stock. So that's the key pathway of introduction. So the bacteria will ooze from infected fruit and cankers in the spring. And the top left photograph shows an immature fruit with the whitish droplets, which is caused by Erwinia, the bacterium, which is oozing and in this sort of milky droplets, which can be spread in wind and rain. And those bacteria will also ooze out from cankers, which have overwintered from the previous season's infections. So it's spread in wind and rain, and also via other vectors such as insects and birds. Primarily infects blossoms and also lenticels on young shoots, and it causes the wilting and death of the flowers and the young shoots in the spring. And you can see the top right and the lower left photographs are showing the classic symptoms of blackening and scorching of the leaves here and the shoots. And it's this scorched appearance that gives the disease its name. It looks like the trees have been, or the affected foliage has been scorched by fire. So the pathogen extends down the shoots and then goes into the main stem and branches where it forms cankers. So you get these reddish brown lesions which extend into the sort of woody part of the host, and they kill the trees by girdling. And then, as I said, the bacterium overwinters in the cankers. And the lower right photograph here shows a canker which is starting to develop in the stem of a young affected tree. There are no chemical methods of control. But it's known that late flowering cultivars of fruit trees are most susceptible. This is because the bacterial populations build up as the summer progresses. And so early flowering cultivars may escape the peak infection period. So I think the advice is to prune out and burn any infected tree parts. And I think the RHS website suggests cutting back 30 centimeters into healthy wood. Need to prune during extended periods of dry weather if possible, to prevent sort of infection of the cut material, the cut shoots and branches. And disinfect your pruning tools is always pertinent to do that, or prudent, I should say, to do that with. You can do it with 10% household bleach or white spirits. You can also remove late blossoms before they open, because blossoms are a main conduit to infection of the tree. And something which is very key is ensuring that you buy healthy trees from a nursery operating to high biosecurity standards. And I know that's something that the following speaker will be talking more about. The lower photograph here is of a rowan tree in a native woodland planting in South Scotland that myself and some colleagues went out and looked at back in September. And a lot of, well, actually all of the rowan was to a certain extent affected by these symptoms, which subsequently a colleague of mine discovered was turned out to be fire blight. So, question, because it's in a fairly remote valley and not much inoculum kicking around, I would have thought, before the trees were planted. So I'm wondering if the disease had actually come out to the site on infected planting stock. So something to consider. So now I'm going to move on to talk about horse chestnut bleeding canker, which is a pathogen that I have worked on quite intensely for about 7 years. This pathogen, this bacterium, Pseudomonas syringae esculi, and it is, as you can see, the photograph, the top left photograph, the black and white one, is of this bacterium. It's taken under electron microscope, so very, very high magnification. And you can see the oval sort of dark structure is the body of the bacterial cell. And you can see these filaments which come out from one end. These are the flagella, which help to propel the bacteria in water. And if you look at the bacterium under a microscope and in water, they're zipping around very, very quickly. The upper right photograph is a culture of the bacterium on agar, and under UV light it fluoresces, and this is again another sort of diagnostic feature that we can look for when we're trying to identify the pathogen. Now, interestingly, the pathogen, the bacterium, originates in India. It was first reported on Indian horse chestnut, causing just a very minor leaf spot disease, nothing significant at all, largely because it's probably evolved on this host, and the host has evolved with the pathogen, and it doesn't cause such severe damage. And the Indian horse chestnut is native in the lower regions of the Himalayas and the sort of Himachal Pradesh region of India, in sort of cool, wet, cloudy climatic conditions. So some work that we did with a PhD student showed that a single strain actually came into Northwest Europe at some point, probably during the late 1990s, and started spreading quite rapidly in the Netherlands and Belgium, first of all, and then was first reported in Britain in the early 2000s, and now it's widespread throughout Britain. And the lower right photograph just shows some sort of a horse chestnut tree with some cracking and bleeding caused by the bacterial disease. So horse chestnut, you probably are aware that horse chestnut is not native to Britain. It's native to the Balkan region and continental Europe. And it was introduced into Britain in around the 16th century. So it was planted here, it was introduced here, and we don't know what the diversity, the genetic diversity is of horse chestnut in the UK. But we do know that when the epidemic spread across Britain, about a third of Britain's horse chestnut trees were killed outright as the epidemic spread. So these trees would have been highly susceptible individuals. And now what we have 20 years on, after the epidemic is passed through, and we're now living with the horse chestnut bleeding canker as an endemic pathogen, many trees actually survive. They live with the infection. We believe they're partially resistant. And many of these trees will look like the tree here in the photograph. They've got, look unwell. They don't look great. They have the cracks and the bleeds and the tarry spots on the bark, which I'll show you in a minute. And they've got some branch dieback, but they remain live. So that's what we're seeing in a lot of our horse chestnuts now. You may be asking if the pink flowering horse chestnut is susceptible. Yes, it is. And we also see some horse chestnut trees which remain entirely healthy, and we believe that these have natural resistance. In terms of symptoms and infection, we know that the bacterial cells, this is work that I did with my colleagues over a few years, that bacterial cells enter the shoots and branches via lenticels and leaf scars and nodes and sort of wounds in the bark. And what happens, we get a lot of infections occurring in the spring. So when the shoots are extending, at that time of year, the tree is very rapidly transpiring. So the lenticels actually are quite say permeable to bacterial cells entering. So you get these are the lenticels here in this top left-hand photograph, and you can see the blackening around them is where the bacterium has got in and is starting to establish here. And this shoot on the right-hand side, again, you can see little lesions starting to develop around lenticels. We also believe that infection occurs in the autumn, particularly when you get early early autumn storms and you get early leaf blow, so the leaves are ripped off, and the leaf scars then breathe for a period of time are quite vulnerable to bacterial infection. So the infection starts with this black lesions. They extend down the young shoots, and then when they get to the main stem and the branches, they extend, they cause cankers. You get these tarry spots, as you can see on the photograph here, bleeds and cracks on the bark, which are very typical of horse chestnut bleeding canker, and that gives the disease its name. And then branches and whole trees die when they're girdled by the bacterial lesions. So finally, in terms of control, again, we don't have any chemical control available for horse chestnut bleeding canker. But there are many of you perhaps listening into this manage chestnut trees. And we do recommend that if you have moderate or mildly infected trees, they could live for some time with the disease, so you don't need to fell them. We suggest that you would prune and remove any heavily infected branches, especially if they pose a danger, if they're over roads or pathways. The bacterium, we also know, can survive in soil for extended periods, so it's important to disinfect your boots, tools and vehicles when working with infected trees. And then finally, some good news again is that some studies in the Netherlands, and I've been communicating with some researchers in the Netherlands who have got some trials going, and they're looking at resistant varieties of horse chestnut trees to replace these very important shade trees. And it's so important that we retain shade trees in our towns and cities, particularly with climate change. Anyway, with that, I'd like to say thank you.